Very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We welcome you to another edition of Let's Talk. Good afternoon to those who are listening via Second Advent Radio. We are delighted to be able to come by again for our continuing discussion this afternoon. We started last week talking about mental health issues and what a discussion we had. We are going to be continuing that discourse. We have three very special guests that we will introduce to you in a moment. But before we do so, we would like to invite you to have a word of prayer with us wherever you are at this time. Kindly bow your heads if you're able to as we pray. Father, we give you thanks for the privilege and opportunity we have to come by and to share with our friends in Radio Lands, those who are on Facebook, those who are on YouTube, either on SLC Adventist or SLC Church channel. We pray that you will grant us your peace, your grace, and your guidance as we discuss. Be with our guests and help that they'll be able to share in a meaningful way. In Jesus' name, amen. So welcome again to all of our friends. We are delighted to have you with us wherever you're joining from, wherever around the world you are. We welcome you to Let's Talk with me this afternoon. Three of our guests. In fact, we started this discussion last week, so we are simply moving on, continuing. This is part 2 of our series. We have been talking about mental health issues. Last week, we looked at the whole concept of some of the myths concerning mental health. And this week, we are going to move on. We're going to deal with a few specific cases of mental illness. And then we will also look at the issue of demon possession and distinguishing it from mental illness, determining to what extent it is mental illness. And next week, we will wrap up this discussion. We're going to look at the whole concept of church workers and mental illness. With us this afternoon, we have three guests, the same three guests who were with us last week. I am going to just briefly introduce them to you. We won't go into the details that we shared last week. We have Dr. Andy Manzano, who is a professor, assistant professor in the School of Theology at the University of the Southern Caribbean. Pastor Manzano, good afternoon and welcome. We also have Chaplain Paul Anderson, with us this afternoon. We welcome you back, Chaplain Anderson. Chaplain Anderson is the director of Paul Anderson Coaching and Training. He is a recently retired denominational worker, director, endorser of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries for the North American Division. Chaplain Anderson, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Dr. Sandra Reed. Dr. Reed, I am perhaps committing the unpardonable sin again. My wife said I introduced you last week, and ladies should be first. And there I did it again. But my apologies. We have Dr. Sandra Reed with us this afternoon. Dr. Reed is a psychiatrist. She is a graduate of the University of the West Indies. She currently serves on the campus of the university. Sorry, I got that wrong. My apologies. She currently serves on the campus of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. She is also an elder, in fact, the first elder of the Seventh Adventist Church at USC, the University of the Southern Caribbean. We are delighted to have you with us, Dr. Reed. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Happy to be here again.
Now, last week we had a very meaningful discussion. We want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for the feedback, the reaction that you have given even after the program. Last week we explored some of the myths regarding mental illness. We did not explore all, but such is the nature of these things. We don't ever get time to go into all that we plan to on Let's Talk. Today, we want to consider some specifics of mental illness and then explore distinguishing them from demon possession. So we want to begin today by looking at mental issues that arise from drug use. I want to begin this way. Before I get into the effects of drug use on the brain, which I shall ask Dr. Reed to respond to, I want to ask both Chaplain Anderson and Dr. Manzano. Uh, Today we notice, well, I haven't done any comparative studies, but it appears to me as though more and more people are going into drug use. Many young people, I have seen, for example, an increase in terms of individuals who come to my office for help with either some form of drug addiction, drug overdose, or something to that effect. What are some of the issues that push our young people these days into drug use? Um, I don't know that you have specific answers, but from your experience, what are some of the issues that push people into drug use? Chaplain Anderson, you want to go that first?
I'll take a swing at that. I think that a large part of the drive to experiment with drugs and perhaps be subsequently addicted is cultural norms, deficits in coping skills, and the an absence of a guided sense of purposefulness, task-oriented achievement, and a sense of hope that transcends immediate feelings.
Okay, very comprehensive, indeed. Pastor Manzano, from your experience, you are on a university campus. Of course, you're on a Christian campus, so there may be a distinction. But you also had experience on the field as a minister serving in different congregations, and you interact with people in the community. I don't know what the situation in Trinidad is with respect to access to drugs, recreational drugs such as marijuana, and maybe even heavier stuff, crack cocaine, etc. Recently in my neighborhood, they have decriminalized marijuana, and we're seeing some significant effects of that already. But how do you relate to, or maybe I should ask, in your experience, what Pastor Anderson gave a very comprehensive response to my question, but from the Caribbean perspective, what do you see as some of the reasons why many of young people who perhaps should have had a Christian upbringing or so go into the area of drug use?
From my experience, not only from observation, from experience, from personal experience, okay? Because before I was in the Seventh Adventist Church, graduating into ministry and all of that, I was somebody who was involved in drugs. So I'm not talking about what observation only, I'm talking about personal experience. One of the reasons why young people get involved in drugs is because it is perceived as a rites of passage. The adulthood is associated with drugs. So the first time I was exposed to drugs, the first time I indulged is because it was perceived as you are a big man, you know, you're growing up. Even the consumption of a beer, you know, it is when you are a man. So that is a community practice also. For some individuals, it would be the challenge of coping with situations. But if we do a survey, we would hardly find, in terms of ratio, someone deciding to take drugs because they're depressed, because they don't know the impact of the drugs on them, that it will give them a release. So from my observation, it is mostly associated with the grown-up, the perception of you are big enough to take part in this thing.
Very interesting. Now, for whatever reason, people get involved, or for whatever reason, whether it's peer pressure, whether it's rites of passage, whether it's the whole concept of lack of guidance from families, etc. The reality is that many of these things do have a damaging effect on the brain. And Dr. Reed, this is where I come to you. I have noticed in recent times that a number of persons have been affected, impacted negatively, to the point where some have had to be institutionalized. How do drugs work on the brain to produce this kind of mental health challenge, and how do we deal with such issues?
Okay, thank you. So when we're talking about drugs here, we need to clarify that we're talking about psychoactive drugs. Psychoactive drugs are used recreationally because they make you feel good. And they make you feel good because they act directly on the brain, the neurochemicals of the brain. Now, the effect of any particular drug would depend on which chemical is impacted. And I'm not going to go into the detail of where alcohol works, where marijuana works, where cocaine works, but each one works on one or more of the neurochemicals. And it also depends on which part of the brain is affected by that particular drug. And it would usually be a part of the brain where that particular chemical is active or has some kind of function. It also depends on how much you use, and it depends on the duration of use, right? So what we have is a situation where you can use a drug one-off, you could be a regular user of the drug, you could use small quantities, you could use large quantities, and the impact will be a little different depending on those variables, but is more or less guided by the chemical, the neurochemical that is affected, and the part of the brain that that neurochemical has its action.
So, yes, Dr. Anderson, go right ahead.
I wanted to ask a question, Dr. Reed, about the age of onset of different kinds of drugs, because I think I read that the brain continues developing until about the age of 22 or 23. So
25, yeah.
Some of those drugs that will have a different effect or a longer lasting impact on the brain of a child or an adolescent or young adult than on, say, an older person. Is that true?
Yes, it's the actual impact and effect does not vary because that depends on the neurochemistry. But when we go beyond the neurochemistry to the mental health complications, it does make a difference, the age of onset of use. And I don't know if I should continue with that line.
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So the effect of a drug on the brain, it's not simple, right? I'm going to try to break it down as best I can by, first of all, pointing out that you can have different syndromes. So what I mean by that, you can have mental health effects because a person is intoxicated with a drug. So like we're familiar with alcohol intoxication. We know how somebody behaves when they are drunk because that's alcohol intoxication. We know that their judgment might be affected. We know that the way they speak, their balance, their coordination and so are affected. You can have cocaine toxicity, that's intoxication, and you can have marijuana intoxication. So that's one type of syndrome, and that tends to occur regardless of age, regardless of timing of the onset, because you've used too much of the drug. Once that drug comes out your system, you're back to normal. So that's one type of effect. The other type of effect is what I think we are more talking about this afternoon, and it has to do with when the drug causes a psychiatric syndrome, right? So you can have any one of those three common recreational drugs causing depression, causing anxiety, causing sleep disturbances, causing sexual disorders, causing addiction. And of course, what I'm going to continue talking about is causing psychosis, right? So we call those the drug-induced disorders, drug-induced, caused by the drug. Now, unlike intoxication, where you use it one-off, the drug comes out your system, you're fine, these induced disorders tend to need treatment, but they are different from what I would describe as the primary psychiatric disorders. So marijuana-induced psychosis is different from schizophrenia. They are not the same thing. Schizophrenia is a primary illness of the brain. Marijuana-induced psychosis is caused because you were smoking marijuana, but they look alike. So to the observer, they may be very, very similar. Right?
So Dr. Reed, let me ask you a question here. Now, if someone comes to me, or to anybody for that matter, and says, listen, let's say a parent brings a child, and they say, you know, my son had some friends and he used marijuana for this first time, and now he's hallucinating, he's behaving strange, and I'm getting really concerned because he's not getting over this thing. Those things, do they suggest that this is more than a one-time use?
Not necessarily, because there are people who may use so much in their first use that they develop a marijuana-induced psychosis. And the main determination of a marijuana-induced psychosis, and we're talking about marijuana now, is your genetic risk. That is the main thing that determines whether somebody would become psychotic after using marijuana or not. There are very specific genetic markers that indicate risk. Of course, these are not things we could go to a lab and measure to say, well, okay, you at risk, don't smoke, right? It's interesting that culturally, in cultures where they use marijuana, and Dr. Manzano mentioned the culture, and we talk about cultures where marijuana use is accepted, where they have the 12 tribes and so on. It's very, very interesting what they do, because the young people are introduced to the drug in the presence of the older persons. And once there is any evidence that something has gone wrong mentally, that young person is banned from using. They're not allowed to continue using. So they, in effect, screen out the people who can potentially develop these mental health disorders. And therefore, they could stand and say, oh, marijuana doesn't do anything. Because look, we smoke and we don't have any prevalence of marijuana-induced psychosis. But that's because you screen them out at the beginning. It doesn't necessarily mean the marijuana is safe. So direct response to your question, it can happen in a single use if you smoke enough and if you have the genetic risk.
Okay, that's pretty helpful. Yeah, sure. I asked the question because, you know, there are some persons who seem so negatively affected that I sometimes wonder if this is just a one-time use or consistent use.
Yes, and if I may add, please, to go back to what was shared before by Dr. Anderson about the use, the timing of the use. Even though marijuana does not cause schizophrenia, if you are at risk of developing schizophrenia, marijuana can trigger it. And that is more likely to happen if you begin using marijuana before the age of 25. So the brain becomes fully developed about the age of 25. And it is found that persons who smoke marijuana before that age are about 7 times at risk, higher risk than those who begin their use after 25 in persons who have the genetic risk for schizophrenia. So I hope I'm not confusing. That's a different thing altogether now. That is marijuana triggering the schizophrenia.
Okay, I get you. So my next question would be about treatment. Before we go on, how do we treat these people?
Okay, so intoxication don't really need treatment. I mean, I reference alcohol intoxication because that's common and we see it, right? We all would know people who drink too much, they become intoxicated, they sleep it off, they get up, they're fine. That's because the alcohol is excreted from the body. So I will focus my response on those drug-induced psychoses that we're talking about. Theoretically, you could leave the person and they should get better, but that does not happen. So we do use medication to treat those people. The function of the medication is to restore functioning, or the purpose of the medication is to restore functioning in the individual quickly, because you would have somebody who is hallucinating, who is out of touch with reality, who is probably paranoid and all of those things. You don't want to just sit and wait for them to get better, because marijuana leaves the body very slowly. The reason for that is that THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, is fat soluble. There's a lot of fat in the brain. So when you smoke, that THC is actually stored in the fat of the brain. And that THC takes about 3 months to be excreted. So if you are smoking every day in a 3-month period, by the end of that 3 months, you have 90 days of marijuana in your brain that's being excreted very slowly. And some of the longest stays in the mental hospital in Trinidad are those of young people who smoke marijuana daily. They become psychotic. They take a long time to get better because that marijuana has to be excreted from the brain and it takes long. So you don't sit and wait. You use medication. And the medication restores functioning. So they become free of hallucinations. They're no longer paranoid. They can go to work and whatever. And that marijuana is still being excreted. Once the marijuana is excreted, you can stop medication. This is not a lifelong prescription or anything like that. You can stop. And once you never smoke again, you should not get ill unless you have risk for some other psychiatric illness.
That is very insightful. What I'm here wondering is when governments, I know we're not into politics here, but when governments are debating issues such as whether we're going to make these kinds of recreational drugs available to people and we're going to decriminalize them, etc. Don't they listen to people like you, Dr. Reed?
Well, I hope so. I actually did submit a report to our government of Trinidad and Tobago, concerning prior to the decriminalization of marijuana here. And you have to be careful in the sense that you have to look at the big population, the population data. If you look at population data, the proportion of people who develop mental health disorders is actually quite small, right? So you can't say, don't decriminalize, because you're talking about just, and I don't even know a percentage, so I don't even want to guess, but it's a very, very small proportion of persons who will develop the marijuana-induced psychosis, and an even smaller proportion who are at risk for schizophrenia, and the marijuana will trigger the schizophrenia. But in a case like that, you have to advise caution. So one should decriminalize with the knowledge that smoking under the age of 25 increases risk. Certain people who have a genetic risk, they are more likely to become mentally ill. And hopefully the policies would incorporate those facts to protect the vulnerable population.
Okay, very helpful indeed. Yes. Now, yes, Dr. Anderson.
I don't want to seem like I'm derailing, but what about some of the drugs that are commonly prescribed for people with mood disorders or children that are prescribed medication for ADHD or ADD? Does that impact the development of the brain and lead to future situations?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. You mentioned two types of drugs. You mentioned the antidepressants. The antidepressants, as far as we know, and we've been prescribing them for a very long time, so I think I can say with confidence, the antidepressants do not affect the brain in the manner that I'm describing. When I started responding, I specified that the drugs we're talking about, these recreational drugs, are psychoactive drugs. They act directly on the brain to make you feel good. Antidepressants do not work so. You can't pop an antidepressant pill and feel good the way you would smoke a joint and feel good. Antidepressants actually manipulate the chemistry of the brain to return it to normal. So you don't get a high from antidepressants. And that's why antidepressants take weeks to begin to work, right? So antidepressants restore normal functioning. You have to stay on them long because the brain needs that prolonged push to begin producing more of the serotonin and the other monoamines that are deficient in depression. So short answer, no, the antidepressants do not affect you in that way. But you mentioned ADHD. ADHD is treated with stimulants, and stimulants are psychoactive drugs. Now, don't ask me how or why, because I cannot explain in detail. But if somebody with ADHD uses Concerta Ritalin, any stimulant that is prescribed, they do not become addicted and they do not get the stimulant high. It treats their ADHD, and when it's time for them to stop the drug, they come off. As a matter of fact, Concerta is not a long-term prescription. It's used as needed, right? They can do so without a problem. However, if somebody who does not have ADHD uses a prescription drug like Concerta, it is like using a street drug. It is like using a stimulant drug. And you can become addicted and it can cause problems. So it does affect the brain adversely.
Let's see that I get that right. If they do have ADHD and you prescribe the drug, they do not become addicted.
That's
but
correct.
If they don't and they use it, then it can be impacting.
That's right. That's like going on the street and buying a stimulant.
Oh.
Yeah. And which is what happens on campuses a lot, because people with ADHD allegedly sell their medication to their peers at exam time, you know, because it's a stimulant. It keeps you awake so you can study, but at risk, yeah.
Pastor Manzana, I want to ask you, there are people who have this notion that if an individual is a Christian, that individual will not have any issues with drugs, because for some reason or the other, the church is going to shield them from the drugs. Now, because this is a program where we're discussing issues, I'm asking this question. There are some parents, for example, who feel, well, I send my child to a Christian school and my child is in a Christian university, I don't have to worry about them using drugs. What would you say to such a parent?
Well, we live in a real world. We have to be practical, okay? They practice the tendency to do wrong, the temptation for sin. It is not limited to any particular place. And we also find, even on campuses that are denominational schools, you see evidences of all sorts of practices taking place. You know, I wouldn't want to list them, but I just say it broadly, so that young people should be taught to avoid certain things. They should be taught how to manage themselves. And the fact that we are Christians or coming from Christian family does not insulate us from those challenges. So parents should be told that, and they should be also taught, parents and children, to look for signs. You know, a parent should know what are the signs to look for when if their children indulging in some kind of substance. So I'll leave it there.
Chaplain Anderson, you wanted to add something to that. I can see that on your face.
Oh my, it's that plain. I painfully reflect on the question that you asked. Illicit drugs are real on any campus because sin knows no boundaries. I have a family member who was introduced to drugs at church school, elementary school, and fights an addiction today. So it does happen.
Okay, so for all those parents who are listening, I asked the question so that you do understand that notwithstanding, there are tremendous benefits of church school, definitely, but yes. You must bear in mind that we live in a real world. Now, we have limited time. Time is going quickly, and I do want to get to a few things. I want to go back to you, Dr. Yu. Another form of mental health that is not very well understood. You mentioned before, in fact, and you were distinguishing between that which is induced by drug use. I'm talking about schizophrenia. Some rather commonly call this split personality. I'm aware that is not necessarily the case. So can you give us a sense of how we explain it, and just for education purposes?
Okay, all right. So you're correct. Schizophrenia and having a split personality or multiple personality, they are not synonymous. There is, in fact, a psychiatric disorder called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, that is completely different from schizophrenia. If we want to use the word split in describing schizophrenia, I think we would have to say that it is a split from reality, because schizophrenia actually is impaired reality testing. That's the term that we use. You are not in touch with reality. You cannot tell what's real and what's not. Now, last program, I would have mentioned that when we talk about mental functioning, we talk about three main areas: your thinking, your feelings, and your behavior. Schizophrenia is a disorder of thinking. It primarily affects your thoughts, because you have too much of a particular chemical called dopamine in your brain. So it will cause thought disorder. And what I mean by that is the thoughts are disconnected, they're rambling, they are put together without any kind of sensible link. So the listener will naturally say that person is talking nonsense. That's what we tend to hear from relatives. He's talking nonsense or she's talking nonsense, because the thoughts are disordered and rambling. Of course, if the thoughts are disordered and rambling, it reflects in the speech. So you have rambling, disordered speech, and the most direct and the most commonly identified effects on thoughts are delusions. And there's I use that term, even though it's a psychiatric term, because in the Bible, we know that pretty soon a lot of persons are going to be under strong delusion if they are not already. I leave that to the theologians to elaborate on. But delusions, by definition, are fixed false thoughts. The thoughts are false, but the person believes them as if they were true. So you cannot argue a person out of a delusion. That's wasting time, because for them it's true, even though it's not true. So schizophrenia, the patient presents with delusions, most commonly paranoid or persecutory delusions. People want to hurt them, people want to harm them, people are bad talking them, and they may also have grandiose delusions. They think that they've been called to save the world, or they have millions of dollars, they're going to be the next CARICOM president, a post will be created for them, and that kind of stuff, right? So they have rambling thoughts, rambling speech, delusions, and they also hallucinate. So they hear things and see things which are not real, but they believe that they are real. So you can't tell them, nah, man, nobody else seen it. That's not true. They are seeing it. To them, it's real. That is their reality. Now, because of these disordered thoughts, the other aspects of mental function tend to be affected. Because if you think people are against you, you are going to board up your house. You are going to not go outside. So your behavior is affected. Your emotions become affected. You become terrified. You become sad. You become, all these other emotions. And of course, your function will be affected, because you're not going to go to work. You're not going to eat. You have to get some relative to taste the food first to be sure it's not poisoned. So you have this comprehensive picture of affected thoughts, emotions, behaviors, but the primary malfunction is in the thinking.
Now, when a person gets to a stage like that, for whatever reason, I mean that's another question. What causes people to get there? But when a person gets to a stage like that, I suppose they also do not see themselves as in need of help. And that makes it complicated. So how do you help them?
And that's the difficulty. So the term that's used is they have no insight. There are a few people who may have insight. They may say, this thing is happening to me and I know it can't be true, but yet I'm experiencing it. But by far the majority lack insight. They do not believe that anything is wrong with them. And that is a nightmare for relatives, because they will not agree to go for help. They will not accept help, even if a doctor is brought to them. And that's where the law comes in. So every country would have a mental health act, which would allow for a patient with adequate evidence and after adequate evaluation to be hospitalized and treated unwillingly for a certain period of time. And that's the only way we get those persons to get help.
I don't know what it is in Trinidad, but the mental institutions in these places tend to carry a certain degree of stigma. Look, now our mental institution is called Clearview Psychiatric Hospital, but it is commonly referred to as Crazy House. So if a person is institutionalized, folks will say, oh, that person has been admitted to the Crazy House. So it carries a certain stigma. I don't know if that is the case in Trinidad and Tobago. There is this belief that individuals who are admitted in these institutions, that they are shocked into reality. They tie them in this chair, they give them electric shocks, and the average person has that in his or her mind and say, I don't want to go to these institutions because I'm going to end up in a permanent state. And if you can just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. And we have to thank Hollywood in part for that, because the portrayal of mentally ill persons in movies and so give you that kind of impression. Of course, there's some truth in what is said. The stigma is real, and that's something we should all be working on, especially in the church, because the church too can be guilty of stigmatizing persons with mental health disorders. But the idea of shocking people into treatment and tying them down, and so there are occasions where physical restraints are necessary to prevent somebody from hurting themselves or others. And electroconvulsive therapy, which is shock therapy, is one of the most effective forms of intervention that I am aware of. I remember when I was training in psychiatry in Jamaica, we did our ECT rounds 3 times per week. We'd go with the tray, and there's a very humane way to do it. It's not as it's portrayed in the movies at all. You actually give the person a muscle relaxant, so their muscles relax. So when they get the seizure, you don't see the kind of convulsion that you would see in an epileptic, let's say, having a seizure. But it's a very effective way of treatment. It's done for about 3 weeks, and the person is fine. They continue with medication. So the distortion of these effective forms of treatment contribute to the stigma, right? But persons do get better from schizophrenic and psychotic disorders. We follow a kind of 1/3 rule. 1/3 of persons will become fully functional again. They take their medication, they're fine, they go back to work. 1/3 will recover, but they do not regain the pre-morbid or the pre-illness level of functioning. And 1/3, unfortunately, do sometimes need to be institutionalized or to stay on long-term medication.
Very well. Dr. Manzano and Dr. Anderson, I'm going to put this question to you both first before I ask Dr. Reed to comment on it. And we're going to try to keep this short because I don't want to get into the whole idea of, distinguishing between demon possession, etc. But depression has become so common these days that we can hardly overlook it. At the same time, there are those who say, those good quote unquote church people who will make statements like, well, we are children of God, we should not be depressed. I want you to react to that statement. Either of you could take the first jump at it.
I shoot first, and then I'll turn to Dr. Anderson.
I was going to defer to you. Depression is real, and depression does affect Christians. One could make a case that the agony that Christ endured in the Garden of Gethsemane was a depressive event. It wasn't 6 months because he didn't have that much time, but he was wrestling with his reason to be. And when we wrestle, even with faith, sometimes it can be dispiriting, and Christians can become dispirited. I think I have a pretty good track record for being a good Christian man. But I have experienced quite a lot. I am familiar with grief. I buried over 600 people at Arlington National Cemetery. I've watched a sailor who jumped overboard drown. I've responded to mass negative incidents over numerous occasions in my chaplaincy career. So I am not embarrassed or ashamed to say that I have had moments of depression or periods of depression. And it isn't uncommon. Ellen White counseled her husband to slow his roll and to take time because he struggled, James White struggled with depression and depressive events to the point of having suffered a nervous breakdown. So it's not uncommon that Christian people can become depressed. The thing that becomes effective in our depression is the application of our faith and the leaning forward on the everlasting arm than leaning back in fear of what we've come through.
Thank you so much. Dr. Manzano.
Yes, sir. When I looked at this, this whole discussion and the question, my mind scans through the Bible, and there are enough evidences to show people who are what we would call biblical characters, godly people who experience depression. Okay, and for me, in the simplest term, depression is from a dictionary perspective, depressed means to be weighed down. There's a weight on you and you cry that you are not able to bear the weight. To me, that's a simple definition of depression. But this is psychological, or Dr. Reed is more experienced in these terms. It's a weight. Job cried out about in his experience. Jeremiah cried out. Elijah ran to a cave and told God, I can't take any more. I might as well die.
So in other words, our church brethren don't have to feel that something is wrong with their Christian connection because they're depressed.
Depression is not a denial of faith. Depression is simply an acknowledgement of you in a situation that is weighing you down.
Now, thank you so much again. Now, Dr. Reed, when Chaplain Anderson spoke just now, he used the term nervous breakdown, suggesting that one can lead from one stage to another stage. So let's, from the medical perspective, what's going on in the brain?
Okay, all right. So I'm not going to take off on where Dr. Anderson left, right? Because this notion of a progression from the normal depression, if we want to use that term, to the unhealthy nervous breakdown depression is not quite accurate, right? Let me put it this way. You asked what is going on in the brain. I'm going to approach it from a treatment perspective because I think that would best explain, right? We treat mental health disorders when there is something going on in the brain. But the majority of people who experience depression are the people described by Dr. Manzano and Dr. Anderson, right? So we could be depressed, which is a perfectly normal reaction. So sometimes I wake up in the morning and I know the workday ahead of me is going to be a tough one, and I feel depressed. And what do? I sigh, I get up, I exercise, I have a shower, and I'm ready to go and take it on, right? That's normal. But there is an alteration of the mood that includes sadness, right? Then you have situations where the depression is longer and it is probably a little more severe. You can't just snap out of it with a shower and some exercise, but it is culturally appropriate. So here we're talking about bereavement. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we're talking about tabanca. I don't know what the other islands call it, but that's when you break up with your loved one and you still want the relationship, but they don't. So people here undergo tabanca. Those last a little longer, but the treatment you might need might be to talk to a trusted friend, to talk to a counselor, to take a few days off and go to the beach. So there's an intervention, but not a medical intervention. The next level is a little more pathological, if we want to use that word. And this tends to occur in persons who grew up with dysfunction, persons who are more inclined to have personality disorders. When under stress, they can become depressed, and that depression can last for weeks, and they require an intervention to do better. But most times that intervention is not medication. These are the people who will benefit from therapy and counseling. And then we have the last category of people who are the minority, who have a genetic vulnerability to developing a psychiatric disorder, either a major depression or a bipolar depression. And these people are commonly described as people who have the nervous breakdown. They need medication. Right? So I guess the point I'm making is that anybody who is depressed needs an intervention, but the intervention is different. It could be support, it could be intercessory prayer, it could be counseling, it could be a change in your environment, and sometimes it's medication.
Two quick questions here for you from our listeners. One earlier when we were talking about marijuana, somebody wants to know, does the tea give the same effect as smoking it?
Yes, and sometimes worse, because ingested marijuana through the teas and the cookies and the gummies and all of that, when it accumulates, it accumulates more quickly, and it is even harder to be excreted, right? So you find that the psychosis that would come from oral consumption of marijuana tends to be more severe. But fortunately, people using marijuana orally tend to have smaller quantities of ingestion, but you still have to be cautious if you are at risk for a psychiatric disorder.
So you would not advise an individual, therefore, there is this idea, okay, this thing is good for jaundice, it's good for the eyes and that kind of stuff. And so I have a few plants in my yard, I'm going to make some tea with it. You would suggest that people get guidance in those cases?
Yes, they should get guidance. All
right. The second question, somebody sent this personally because they wanted to make sure it's asked. Is narcissism a mental illness? Is it a type of mental illness?
Dr. Greene, you're going to have a completely different series for that. The short answer is yes. We're talking about the personality disorders. The personality disorders have a unique position in the psychiatric disorder classification. I'm not sure whether we mentioned that last week. Might have. They are not mental illnesses that require medication, but they are not normal either, because the amount of interpersonal problems that arise from personality disordered people, that they require treatment intervention in their own right. So the narcissistic personality disorder is one example of a personality disorder. So the answer is yes, it requires treatment.
Okay.
Most people don't think so, but it does.
Thank you so much. Now we have about 10 more minutes, and wow, we do need a fourth session indeed. But anyway, I want to go on to this concept because perhaps it's because I'm personally invested in it. I've had so many individuals who are quick to conclude that an individual is exhibiting some strange signs, and well-intentioned, well-meaning elders suggest that these persons are demon-possessed, and they proceed without counsel, without caution, to go cast out a demon. Now, I've had a few cases of demon possession, but Pastor Manzana, perhaps you have in Trinidad. I think I can say that it's a lot more common in Trinidad than it is where I live. So could you just speak a bit to some of the issues involving demon possession?
In my personal experience, you hear a lot of talk, but my personal experience, I would have been exposed to one situation that was described as demon possession. I saw people behave disorderly, but not manifestation. I have heard of incidents. I think one of the things that people confuse, beginning with what Dr. Reed is saying, we have the mental illness as one case, and we have the matter of spiritual possession. When I read scripture, I see harassment, I see affliction, and I see possession. And sometimes I believe some people overlap these things and class everything as demon possession. And I would not be quick to label anybody as demon possessed, Pastor, because when you tell somebody they are demon possessed or they're likely to be demon possessed, they begin to think that way. And that exposes them to another dimension. So I prefer to deal with the physical issue first before I get into that direction, because that is exposing you and the individual, the client, to a dimension that may not necessarily be true.
Now my concern here is, and I can share a few experiences. Of course, we do have the matter of confidentiality that we can't breach. So I can only be general in descriptions, but you do have situations where very minor individuals do extraordinary things, so you may have a 5-year-old or speaking with a voice that is monstrous. You may have a situation where a very young person lifts something that is just impossible for ordinary human to lift. I've seen cases where there is levitation, etc. Which conditions cannot be explained ordinarily. But the concern that I have is that there are cases, and these are conditions which can make you conclude that something out of the ordinary is happening here. The concern I have, though, is when an individual goes to church and the individual says, I have a pain in my side, I've been having this pain in my side for 3 weeks, and the pastor calls up the individual and says, listen, you have a demon, I'm going to cast out that demon. And then there's a demon for everything. There's a demon for sex, there's a demon for headache, there's a demon for, that. I think sometimes, I remember on one occasion, there was this person who genuinely had some sort of health condition, and there was conclusion that this must be a demon. And when you proceed to cast out a demon that is not there, I think, Pastor Manzano, you're saying that is opening up the avenue for demons to come likewise. So that's the concern I have in cases like these. Chaplain Anderson, I don't know that you want to react to that.
I too have heard more about demonic confrontations than I've experienced, but I have experienced several, more than a few. I think these things are recorded in scripture so that we have them as examples. They do happen. They can happen. And then we're counseled that we should not have a spirit of fear, but operate with spiritual confidence that God is with us and has empowered us, as with his disciples, even to cast out demons. But I do not believe that every aberration from a human norm is demon possession. But I don't believe that any minister of the gospel should go hunting demons. Jesus didn't do that. But when they came into his presence, he addressed them. I think that is appropriate, that if we are confronted with something that is evidently not normal, that we should be able to call on the name of Christ and rebuke the devil. Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world, with that kind of spiritual confidence. Time doesn't allow for stories, but that's my take.
Thank you so much. Now we have a very short time, and I think it's appropriate for us to end by looking at this final aspect here. Of course, we continue next week, and we're going to be talking to the issue of mental health issues among church workers. That is a presentation, a discussion that I think is so very important. But the matter of prevention or taking care of our mental health, and Dr. Reed, if specifically you can react to this. Well, maybe not even Dr. Reed only, because a good part of this, I suppose, is our own reliance on God. But the matter of what I call prevention, what we may want to call mental health alertness and practice. Why is it so important, and how do we go about doing this?
That's me.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, all right. So let me start with the why. Why is this so important? Quality of life. Anybody living with a mental health issue, whether it's a personality disorder or a full-fledged mental illness or a drug-related problem, would have impairment in functioning. So we want to be able to address this so that the person can have an adequate quality of life and fulfilling interpersonal relationships. But there is also the matter that we don't talk about a lot, that relationship between mental health and physical health. If you are struggling with mental health issues, it is likely to impact your physical health. Mental health issues can result in physical illness. It can worsen physical illness. And sometimes, many times, it affects the prognosis and recovery from physical illness. So when we talk about health holistically, we cannot exclude mental health. How do we do it then? I want to start at a point in the past. When I say in the past, an individual now cannot change what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it because I think it's so important. Parenting. Parenting, healthy parenting influences an individual's risk of mental health problems. So I think we should invest a lot of energy in parenting. But once you become an adult, and we all carry our baggage, some have heavy bags, some have lighter bags, New Start is a very effective way of dealing with your mental health. And as has been mentioned on so many occasions since we've been talking this afternoon, faith. Trusting in the promises of God, because if we trust in those promises, I always say a mentally ill Christian is an oxymoron. It doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen.
Theologians, your contribution.
My contribution, I think I would want to advise someone to value, to listen to the opinion of trusted voices. There must be people in your experience that you can depend on to give you their judgment on your behavior, how you are functioning, and to feedback, because I can't psychoanalyze myself. You know, I might be malfunctioning, being dysfunctional, and trusting my opinion. There should be people in my circle that I can get feedback from about my behavior and how I am functioning.
Chaplain Anderson, final words. You're muted.
Three things come to mind. One is spiritual leaders should know their limits in dealing with their parishioners and community. And when mental health issues exceed our ability to meet them, we should have within our network people like Dr. Reed to whom we can make confident referrals. The second thing is that initial therapy, as Dr. Reed mentioned, when you have minimal moments of depression, exercise is important. She mentioned New Start, and that's important. Someone told me years ago that your brain will not allow, your body will not allow your brain to be depressed when it is forced to lift heavy weights and move fast. So get busy, get some exercise, that helps. And we as a church and church leaders need to destigmatize people's request for mental health assistance. There's nothing wrong with asking for help. God gave Elijah food, a nap, and time off.
Very well. That's an excellent place to stop today. We want to thank you all so much. Next week, we have our final session in the series. We're going to be talking about mental health among church workers. It is an important discussion that all of you listening now need to be in on. We will have an additional guest next week, hopefully, a psychologist. So we have been hearing from a psychiatrist, and we're going to be joined also by a psychologist, and it would be good to get that additional perspective. I want to thank all of you so much. We look forward to seeing you next week in our discussion. May God bless you until 3 p.m. next week. Dr. Anderson, next week, your time is going to be different by 1 hour. I think you have daylight saving times beginning tonight or something to that effect, so that it'll be 3 p.m. all around. May God bless you all, and looking forward to